Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
I'm with Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, the founder of Biocon Ltd, India's biggest biopharmaceutical company. We'll be talking today about a certain book extract from Miss Kat Eban, and her book is about the state of Indian pharma today. So, ma'am, can you tell me a little bit about what you thought of the extracts that you've seen and how you think the kind of portrayal sort of affects Indian pharma as a whole?
So first and foremost, I think the readers should understand that this is a book that has been written about an event that took place 15 years ago. Okay, almost. So it's over a decade old, and it pertains to Ranbaxy at a time when there was a whistleblower who actually, did reveal a lot of misdoings at Ranbaxy's, development center and drug manufacturing and drug development efforts. And I think that issue has been, talked about, discussed, debated, and, we've chewed the cud for a long, long time. And I don't think that in 2019, we need to again let that event resurface, because it did do a lot of damage to Indian industry. It did do a lot of damage to Ranbaxy, and there was a lot of unfair collateral damage to other Indian pharmaceutical companies at the time. But I think we should also realize that such books are very dangerous because they very selectively pick in a very anecdotal way about certain events or incidents in an Indian pharmaceutical company. And then they kind of paint the whole sector as being a very unreliable sector, which I think is extremely dangerous, very biased, and I don't subscribe to most of what is being written in that book because it starts with a very old incident which has been addressed and, it's been resolved over time. The company no longer exists. It's been bought over by Sun Pharma. And I don't think it's fair to write such a book just because you want sensational writing, just because you want to sell your book, and just because it suits you to punch a bag which is so easy to punch. The trouble is that there are perceptions in the world, and it's very easy to start whipping sentiments around that perception. So what this author is doing is something which I don't think is becoming for good, honest reporting.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on why you think this is dangerous and what kind of public reaction such pieces could cause, which you think are sort of unfair reportage of the Indian pharma as it is today?
I think it's very important for people at large and the world at large to know that global healthcare has benefited hugely from the Indian pharmaceutical industry and from generic drugs that the Indian pharmaceutical industry produces for the world. Okay? And without this, I think the healthcare burden on every part of the world, especially on the developed part of the world, would be huge. Today healthcare costs are spiraling out of control, especially in the developed world. And if it wasn't for generics, believe me, even the developed world could not afford the healthcare costs that it today can afford because of generic drugs. India today, in terms of sheer volume, accounts for over a third of generic drugs being sold in the world. And in many parts of the world, generic drugs account for almost 40 to 50% of different markets. So I think the Indian pharmaceutical industry is playing a very crucial role in making sure that global healthcare costs are contained and that there is affordable access to life-saving drugs and to important drugs for every patient across the world. Let's not forget that role that Indian pharma is playing. And let me also, add to that by saying that, yes, I think every industry around the world will have black sheep, but you don't focus on the black sheep. You focus on that part of Indian industry that is, doing this yeoman service for the world, right? And to me, if you look at the reliable, authenticated Indian pharma companies who have all been inspected by US FDA and EMA, these are very, very credible companies, very responsible companies. These are companies that are investing hugely in constantly improving their quality management systems. So I think it's very unfair to pick on one or two incidents and paint the whole country with a bad profile. So I think it's time that people really understood the real facts and didn't just focus on anecdotes. You will always have a few anecdotes here and there. And I think another very unfair thing that the perception hurdle is being created for India is that, oh, India is a poor country, it's a filthy country, and therefore if you can imagine what industry in India is all about. That is a very wrong and dangerous and unethical way of writing about the pharmaceutical industry in India.
Right. Would you think the pharmaceutical industry as well as the regulatory bodies are at par with international standards?
So let's put it this way. There are a large number of Indian pharmaceutical companies who are being inspected and audited and cleared by the most stringent regulatory authorities in the world. In fact, India has the largest number of drug dossiers being approved by the US FDA after the US anywhere in the world. We also know that the same holds true for the European regulators. Now, as far as the Indian regulator is concerned, I think the challenge we have in India is that we have a central regulator who's doing a great job of coming up with very stringent regulations which are on par with global regulators. But then we have the problem of the state level regulators. And this is where I think we really have a problem. So the state level regulators are certainly not doing a good job in many states. I would also hasten to add that some states, the state regulators are doing a decent job, but in many states they are not. And what happens is that when the state regulators are trying to basically turn a blind eye to some of the wrongdoings of small companies, small pharmaceutical companies which exist in those states, I think that's where we earn the bad name. And the problem is that many of these small companies are SMEs. And again, you get into that whole trap of don't be harsh to SMEs. They also need support. Yes, but they need support by building good regulatory practices, right? But if you start, being kind or not kind, but if you start sort of lowering your regulatory standards, and they of course are most often than not the lowest bidders, and then they get the contracts or the tenders, and then their quality is found wanting at some spot inspection, that's where then the problem arises. And I think therefore it is very important that the state regulatory authorities have to beef up their systems and their approaches. But I would say at the center, we have a very strong regulator, and that regulator always wants to be on par with international regulatory bodies. But I find that where we are really weak is at the state level. So my view is that any company that is exporting to...
And do you think... do you see the situation improving in maybe 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line? Are we on the right track?
I think, if you look at it, it's not that we've lost our business in the developed worlds. I mean, US and Europe continue to be very dependent on Indian generics. And I think the US FDA inspectors and auditors obviously are being a lot more stringent on Indian companies because of all this writing, which is unfair. So these are almost becoming forensic audits because of this kind of bad media and bad publicity that is coming out of these unfair quarters. But having said that, I would still say that I think Indian companies and the government should do a better job of profiling India's role in global healthcare. I can tell you that when I look at Indian facilities and compare them to even facilities in the US, believe me, we have much better facilities. Okay, we have far greater automation in many of these facilities. We have state-of-the-art, equipment and instrumentation in many of these facilities. And so I think it's unfair to kind of, paint this picture in the world that, what else can you expect from India? Because, this is a poor country. I don't think they are very up to technology, which is not correct. Why can't you talk about really the good companies and the good practices? I would have actually respected this publication a lot more if she had done a balanced, writing of the good with some of this, what has happened in the past.
Moving away from this, I just wanted to ask you one last question. Could you speak a little bit about digitization of rural health that you've been involved in?
So, if you think about this huge challenge that India has of universal healthcare, of delivering universal healthcare to every Indian in the country, it is an unsurmountable challenge.
Thank you very much, ma'am. This is Sandhya Ramesh for ThePrint.